Before 1911, all navies around the world had one thing to worry about, and that was the enemy having a bigger gun than yours. Little did the admirals of the past know that the flimsy biplanes that came out of the Great War would change all naval doctrine. Upon the end of World War I, a new ship class would come about to bring a new age, the age of naval aviation superiority. How did this new age come about? How are these new ships used? And how do the aircraft carriers that they are based off of operate? To change the face of warfare, up to this day and beyond, took a great deal of time in revolutionary engineering. These are all questions that would be answered in the Takeoff of naval aviation. On the 28th of March, 1910, Frenchman Henri Fabre flew the first successful powered seaplane, the Aviation, a tri-man float plane, and it made multiple successful takeoffs and landings. This simple aircraft would soon help to get the soon-to-be massive ball that is naval aviation rolling. In 1911, Eugene Ely, a 25-year-old aviation enthusiast, had gotten the approval of the U.S. Navy to attach a wooden deck on the top of the USS Birmingham to attempt to launch off the ship. His plan was approved by the curious higher-ups of the Navy. If his plan worked, the Navy would likely consider more operations like this. On January 18, 1911, in Hampton Roads, Virginia, Eugene Ely took off and landed on the USS Birmingham. This was the true start of the U.S. Navy's rise to aviation superiority. Not 6 months later, the Navy would purchase the Curtiss Model E amphibian seaplane. At the end of World War I, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was formed to limit the size of warships to hopefully prevent large-scale militarization in the future. Many nations all around the world had to strictly limit their ships to a certain tonnage. Many once revered and highly feared dreadnoughts of the early 20th century were disgracefully brought to scrapyards and torn apart due to their gargantuan size. In the 1920s, major development happened after the Great War. Many nations began seeing the potential in aircraft carriers. Since many nations had quite a few ships lying around, some decided to try and turn a few into experimental aircraft carriers. The first to try it were the British. The HMS Argus was the first full-length aircraft carrier. It was built in 1918 on top of the Italian ocean liner the Condoriso. The Condoriso sailed until 1917, when the British purchased her for the aircraft carrier project. The Argus carried at least 16 aircraft in all. The HMS Argus carried out many tests on how to operate an aircraft carrier. A few things that they may have learned was how to stop a plane. Because the deck of the ship was so short, the planes on board could not stop on their own. The first attempts at stopping an aircraft were by using fixed wires strung across the aft of the carrier. All carrier aircraft had a retractable hook at the end of their planes. Once they touched down near a stall speed, the hook would hopefully catch one of the few wires strung across the aft of the deck. The wires did their job, for the most part. Many crashes occurred because of the wires not being able to really move. The pilots would have to be going slow enough so their planes would not jerk on the wires and tip over. They may have also learned how to spot enemy U-boats and how to drop depth charges. Depth charges are high explosives that once dropped into a body of water can tell exactly how deep they are. Once an aircraft spots an enemy sub, they can check roughly what their depth is and change the depth for the charges. Once dropped to a certain depth, the explosion will crack open the hull of the submarine, thus sinking it. The next to try the aircraft carrier was Japan. The IJN's 1922 Hosho was the first purpose-built aircraft carrier to be commissioned. The Hosho was completed in 1922 by the Japanese Navy. It was built from the ground up and saw much action in China, where the pilots may have learned how to dive bomb. The Japanese split up into squadrons of approximately 20 aircraft. Each squadron was part of a wing. The wings were 10 squadrons combined. The aircraft in the squadron would split up into 3 groups, attacking from the left, right, and center of a ship. This was an effort to overwhelm anti-aircraft guns and confuse crews on board, as well as to allow there to almost always be someone who lands a hit on the enemy ship. These tactics would play a huge role in the future of naval aviation development. You may ask, what were the defending ships supposed to do? Nearly all the ships had anti-aircraft guns, but the real name was flak guns. The average size of the shells fired were from 20mm to 128mm in size. The guns would be used in two ways. One, by proximity fuse, which, as seen in the name, would use radio frequencies to tell where the enemy aircraft was relative to the shell's position. Then, they would detonate. The second way was by using a timed fuse. This was good for targeting the altitude of an aircraft overhead. Once the gunner could determine what the altitude of the aircraft was by firing shots off at different times to see which would hit, the firing crew would preset all the rounds after it to that certain time for a precise aim. This works best when targeting for high-altitude bombers, who would stay at the same altitude. The dive bomber's altitude would constantly be changing, so the proximity shells would normally be used to deter these diving aircraft. On all aircraft carriers, one of the most recognized parts is its island. Older aircraft carriers like the Langley and Argus did not have an island because their sole purpose was to test aircraft carrier operations. Once it was clear that the aircraft carrier bridges needed better viewing of the flight deck and the surrounding area, they needed to put one in place. But to add an island would be a real challenge for engineers. Take the USS Yorktown. If you were to add an island, that would list the carrier starboard. Fun fact, putting the island on the starboard or right side was intentional due to the counterclockwise spin of propellers that would make them go to the left. So to stop aircraft from hitting the island upon takeoff and landing, the island was set on the right side. This can be seen in all currently in service aircraft carriers. Engineers had to come up with a way to stop the list. Now the first idea was to move all the fuel to port. Not the best idea, seeing that once all the fuel was used up, the list would come back. So, they decided to physically move all the aircraft and munitions to the port side. But that left a lot of empty space that the crew members would eventually fill up with other munitions due to the lack of space. So, the list would once again come back. The Navy finally decided that they would make the ship several feet wider. This took 2 decades to finally get right. What resulted was the template for all aircraft carriers up until the 1950s. When the U.S. admirals wanted more aircraft on the carriers, there was not enough room in the hangars to store them. So, new aircraft being built were designed so that their wings would fold so that they could be stored much more easily. But this still was not enough. So, the flight deck took the extra aircraft. This could be dangerous if a landing aircraft cannot stop in time. So, a system for stopping aircraft effectively would need to be made. And what the Navy produced was genius. The first use of arrestor wires was on the USS Langley. Multiple wires were strung across the aft of the flight deck. At the ends of these wires were sandbags. As mentioned earlier, the naval aircraft had retractable hooks at the end of the aircraft, which were used to catch these wires. Of course, it took multiple wires to stop the aircraft. As planes went down the flight deck, they would catch more and more of these sandbags until they came to a stop. As newer and better performing aircraft got faster and bigger, the sandbag system became not enough to stop landing planes. The solution? A real arrestor wire system. First developed on the USS Hornet, the landing aircraft snares a wire on the deck. Below, the pull of the wire pushes a ram into a cylinder filled with fluid. As the ram continues down, the fluid only has a small tube to escape through, slowing down the ram and the wire above. The aircraft will quickly stop. 4 of these arrestor wires are set up very close to each other, allowing for the pilot to have multiple chances of catching a wire. If the aircraft is unable to catch a wire, there's a net set up midway down the flight deck. This catches the wheels of the plane, stopping it immediately. This normally results in the aircraft tipping over and wrecking the plane, but it's better than the alternative result of the aircraft crashing into all the other parked ones. The arrestor system is still used on every aircraft carrier after the Yorktown, with modified system being used today that still uses the same principle of a ram slowing down a plane. The next crucial part of an aircraft's role was to fight with torpedoes. The first self-propelled electric torpedoes were developed only 2 years after the end of the American Civil War. Mind you, that is 1867, far before the peak of the Industrial Revolution. The first torpedoes were launched off of fast-moving torpedo boats that would outmaneuver their enemy and strike unexpectedly with a high-explosive torpedo. Continual designs of the torpedo would change and adapt for the times. Because torpedoes needed to be long and have enough explosives to destroy a ship, it would be a while until strong enough aircraft could come about to carry such a powerful weapon. August 12, 1915, when a British short Type 184 seaplane sunk a Turkish vessel off the Dardanelles. This monumental success proved that this new technology could be used effectively. Before we move on, I have to explain what a torpedo is and how it is used. The torpedo uses either an electric motor or pure oxygen as a motor. This motor is used to power a small propeller in the rear of the torpedo to propel it forwards. In the front of the torpedo is its warhead. There's a massive amount of high explosives, powerful enough to crack open the hull of any ship. They are detonated by either direct contact with the ship or by a magnet in the front. This is used when to tell it is in the magnetic field of a steel ship. Then, the torpedo will detonate for the strongest blast. But magnetic torpedoes like the Mark 14 had a 50 to 80% failure rate. But the torpedo is still very impressive. They're most effective when attacking slow-moving ships at close distances. The Douglas TPD Devastator was one of the first torpedo and bomber aircraft the Navy used. It made its first flight on April 15, 1935, but was retired in 1943 because it had become far outclassed by the Japanese. It was armed with one 6.7mm nose-firing machine gun and another 6.7mm Browning in the rear. It had a crew of 3 and carried up to 1,200 pounds worth of bombs, or one Mark 13 torpedo, which was terribly unreliable. It could fly at almost 300 miles per hour, but this cruising speed could only possibly be achieved by having no bomb load. The Bureau of Aeronautics purchased the Douglas TPD Devastator and began to equip them with the carriers USS Saratoga, Enterprise, Lexington, Wasp, Hornet, Yorktown, and Ranger. The early aircraft carriers practiced how to use torpedoes with the Devastators. Air-launched torpedoes work almost exactly the same as a regular ship-launched torpedo, except that they hit the water at 170 miles per hour, giving them a very large speed advantage. Once in close range, the ship cannot dodge. This disadvantage of the battleship would play a huge role in the upcoming conflict in the Pacific, which would see many ships sunk due to this. Torpedo attacks are quite similar to a dive bombing attack. Aircraft split up into 3 groups, attacking from the left, right, and center. This boxes in the enemy ship so that there's always someone who hits the target. Early torpedoes needed to be dropped low and slow at around 110 knots and 50 feet above the surface. But by the end of World War II, they were being dropped at 800 feet and at 410 knots. One of the most important battles in world history took place on December 7, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese task force departed from Japan and set course to the island of Oahu, Hawaii. They had with them 2 heavy cruisers, 35 submarines, 2 light cruisers, 9 oilers, 2 battleships, and 11 destroyers, and the most important assets were the 6 aircraft carriers. It was clear that this was no drill when the USS Oklahoma was struck. Moments later, an 800-kilogram bomb landed on the battleship USS Arizona, causing the foreign munitions to ignite and the immediate sinking of the ship. 1,177 people died aboard the USS Arizona, accounting for half the deaths of that day. The first wave left 11 minutes after they had first arrived, although the original plan was to have the first wave out in 90 seconds. This could not be achieved due to the small area where torpedo aircraft could be effective, forcing them to attack Battleship Row in single file. By the afternoon, the fleet was already gone. The following day, part of the fleet broke off and attacked and captured Wake Island. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. declared war on Japan, then Nazi Germany officially declared war on America. At the end of the day, a total of 2,403 were dead, and 1,178 were wounded. Only a total of 129 Japanese soldiers were killed. Only the battleships USS Arizona, Utah, and Oklahoma were damaged beyond repair. All damaged ships were repaired and sent back out to fight before the end of the war. Soon, all military bases were operational again. Not only that, but the main targets of the Japanese Navy, the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all not present at the time of the attack, sparing them from the onslaught. These carriers would be used at the upcoming Battle of Midway that would decide who would be the champion of the Pacific. One prime example of overwhelming assault was the sinking of the Yamato. The Yamato was, and still is, the largest battleship ever built, the pride of the Japanese Navy. It had a displacement of 69,000 tons and was the most heavily armed ship ever made. thus making it a massive risk for the U.S. Navy to allow it to stay afloat. On April 7, 1945, the Yamato and a small escort were sent to eliminate the U.S. fleet, which had begun its assault on Okinawa only 6 days earlier. A U.S. submarine spotted the Yamato while still 300 miles out. Task Force 58 intercepted the Yamato. The task force had 17 escort carriers, 6 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 58 destroyers, totaling 1,100 aircraft. 400 aircraft were sent to destroy the Yamato immediately. The F-4U Corsairs were sent out to destroy any fighter aircraft that the Japanese might bring to bear. As soon as they arrived in the clear skies over the Yamato, as well as their escort consisting of 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers, it was clear that there was no air cover for these ships due to all the aircraft carriers being sunk by the U.S. The Helldiver bombers were sent out shortly after the F-4U Corsairs at 12:34. The Yamato fired its 18-inch guns with modified anti-aircraft rounds, and the Yamato began making evasive maneuvers to attempt to dodge the onslaught. The Hellcats began to drop their 1,000-pound bombs into the deck of the Yamato, with the first wave scoring 2 non-critical hits. Soon, Avenger torpedo bombers made their runs shortly after the Hellcats. All torpedoes were concentrated onto the port side to up the chances of a capsize. 1 torpedo hit near the bow, making the Yamato take on 3,000 tons of water, which listed the Yamato to port. The second wave had 163 aircraft. The Avengers scored 3 more torpedo hits. The Yamato's captain made a fateful decision. Seeing that the Yamato's list was worsening, he decided to flood the starboard engine room to counter the list. 100 sailors drowned. After more and more torpedo and bomb hits, the Yamato was dead in the water. Kosaka Aruga, the captain, ordered all remaining crew to abandon ship. Aruga retired to his cabin, never to be seen again. Many American aircraft were circling the Yamato to see the fruits of their labor. As the Yamato capsized, unexpectedly, the forward munitions exploded. The explosion took out 7 American aircraft, accounting for 70% of U.S. aircraft losses that day. It was said that the explosion was seen all the way from mainland Japan. The Japanese crew fought valiantly against the American onslaught, but new technology and revolutionary fighting techniques proved far more effective. 3,063 Japanese sailors lost their lives, and only 269 were saved, compared to just 12 American casualties. If it was not clear enough already that the most powerful battleship ever conceived was absolutely no match for the aircraft carrier, then what purpose was there left for the battleship? This battle solidified naval aviation superiority as one of the most important assets for any nation in the world, for now and for the future. Hello, my name is Henry Faulkner, the creator of this project for 2023 National History Day in the Documentary Junior Division. I have spent the last few months working on this project, and it makes me very happy that it marched to the end. I do want to mention that this project will not be competing due to it being over 10 minutes long, but I do hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I used the online action game War Thunder to create shots that fitted my needs when covering certain aircraft in battles. For returning subscribers, I know that this is very different content compared to what I normally post, although I may plan on doing more history-related content in the future. This is my first time creating something like this, and I'm well aware that I could do far better. So, please comment on what you'd like to see done differently and what I did better in. On that note, I would like to wish you all a safe and blessed day, and I'll see you soon.